Did you know that you can paint with watercolor on canvas? It's true, you can actually paint with watercolor on just about any surface imaginable if you use something called watercolor ground. Now, watercolor ground is made by several different companies. You can get it by Core, I think Holbein makes it. I tend to use Daniel Smith. It's very easy to find at pretty much any craft store or through any online art store. This small bottle actually came with the set of Primatech colors I ordered on Amazon. Most of the time you'll find them in larger jars. Now, what is watercolor ground? It's actually a substrate that you paint onto a surface to prepare it to handle watercolor paints. You can paint this on canvas, papers, plastics, hardboard, and you can even use it on non-absorbent surfaces like glass, plastic, and metal. So today I'm going to be doing a side-by-side comparison, painting on a small 4-inch square canvas that I've prepared with watercolor ground, and then doing the same painting on watercolor paper. The paper I'll be using is Sennelier 140-pound cold-pressed cotton watercolor paper. It's a great quality paper, and the cold-pressed surface is my favorite to work on. It just has enough tooth that I can really enjoy the wet and wet effect with it. And I've just taped off a square. It's a little smaller than my canvas, but roughly the same size. So I'll be painting on this square of watercolor paper and the square of canvas. This was just a cheap little canvas I picked up at a craft store, and I prepared it by coating it with 3 coats of watercolor ground. The watercolor ground is easy to apply. You just take a brush, paint it on the surface, and I enjoy a little bit of texture on my canvas when I use watercolor ground. You can see I created this brushy look with the watercolor ground. And adding 3 coats really helps with that because then you can build up the texture as much as you want. Oh, make sure to let each coat dry for a full 24 to 48 hours before applying the next coat. So it does take a couple of days to prepare a surface like this, but if you're patient and spend 2 or 3 days coating your surface, you're gonna have a lot of fun painting on it. This painting behind me was actually painted on a hardboard panel using the watercolor ground. I did the same effect where I painted it with 3 coats of the watercolor ground and added tons of texture in there. The final effect is that it actually kind of almost looks like an oil painting with the texture in it. Stick around to the end and I'll give you some tips for how to seal a painting or varnish a painting at the very end so that you can actually frame it without glass. All right, so let's get into it. The photo I've chosen for this project is just this beautiful rose photo that I took while I was in Oregon. The gardens there were just spectacular, and I snapped this on my iPhone. It's just this lovely orange and yellow rose. So today we're going to do a paint off with watercolor on canvas versus watercolor on paper. I'm going to try to do the exact same painting side by side on each surface so you guys can see what's different, what's the same. I'm going to try to use the exact same techniques. I began by sketching the rose onto each surface, starting with the watercolor canvas, and it was pretty easy to sketch on and very easy to erase as well. I did notice the surface feels a little bit more slick than watercolor paper, a little less dry for some reason. It kind of has this almost rubbery feel to it, but it still was perfect for sketching and erasing on, although I did very minimal erasing. And the watercolor paper, of course, is very easy to sketch on as well. You can definitely see your lines really easily, and it erases almost completely clean, so there's no issues there. Once the sketch was all finished, I pulled out my paints. For this project, I used the Daniel Smith Jean Haines set of 10 granulating watercolors. I love the set. It is so vibrant, and this is one of my favorite yellows I've discovered. This is Nickel Azo Yellow. I began both roses with a wet on dry wash of the Nickel Azo Yellow. It went on beautifully onto the watercolor ground. And I also lost a little of the light on the bottom petal there, but I was able to easily lift it right back out with a thirsty brush. With the watercolor paper, I used the same mix. Actually, my palette was probably a little cleaner by now, so that's why this yellow looks brighter and less murky. But I used the exact same technique, painting wet on dry for the first wash. For my second layer, I went in with another wash of Nickel Azo Yellow, this time more intensely pigmented, wet on dry again, but I also began to soften and smooth and adjust my values for the yellows. Also starting to suggest at the texture and turn of the petal on the side. You can see I tried to match my values really closely with the one on the watercolor ground and the painting on the watercolor paper, but they aren't exactly alike. No matter how closely you try to follow yourself, it's almost impossible to paint an exact copy of your first painting, I've discovered. But you can see those look pretty similar. The yellow shows up beautifully and brilliantly on both surfaces. Next, I mixed up a light wash of Opera Pink, and I used this for the stem of each rose and on the tips of some of the leaves. With the Opera Pink, I began the process of layering a pink color over the top of my yellow. This produces that orange color that we see in the reference photo. I also tested out softening with both surfaces. I start with a dark color and then use a second brush that is thirsty or damp to gently soften that edge. It worked perfectly on both surfaces. I didn't really see any difference in how each one responded to this technique. So it was really quite a joy to be able to paint the two paintings side by side, noticing very little difference in my techniques. I really didn't have to adjust anything in my style of painting in order to get the same result with both surfaces. For wet on dry especially, it's just a very intuitive way to paint. It's very easy to get similar results when you're laying down the same kinds of brush strokes and softening them the same way. I did notice with the watercolor paper, as you see here, the surface is just a little bit drier, and so you may need a little extra water when you're painting on the paper versus the watercolor ground. You can see how smoothly wet on dry goes with watercolor ground. It's almost like painting on an aqua board if you've ever tried one of those. Very similar in its response. So with the details finished up with the rose, I just darkened up some of the leaves and finished up the petals. Onto the background. Now this is really the only place where I noticed a drastic difference between the two surfaces. I like to use wet and wet to create a soft, diffused, blurry looking background. And on the watercolor canvas, you really see the texture of the watercolor ground beneath the surface. I also noticed that the water and paint tend to spread out just a little bit more than they do on the paper. For some reason, it seems like when you wet the surface of the watercolor ground, it flows a lot. So you can expect really beautiful soft edges, but also maybe a little of that color will seep into even some of your dry areas. So you can see I worked in quadrants. I did one little section at a time, but right here you can see some of that paint did seep into the rose slightly, even though I did not wet the edges of the rose. So that was something I did notice that was definitely different about the watercolor ground. Still, it lends itself beautifully to these wet and wet effects. You can see how easily the paint softens out, producing those beautiful, soft, seamless edges. It did look a little blotchy, so I decided I'd probably need to go back and add a second layer. But before doing that, I went ahead and did wet and wet in the background on my watercolor paper. You can see there's a subtle difference in how the paint responds to the paper versus the watercolor ground. I definitely noticed a lot more of the granulation in these paints with the paper for some reason. It really highlights the beautiful, almost grainy look of granulating paint when you use a cold pressed or rough pressed surface. And there's something about the way paper absorbs the paint that is just different from the watercolor ground. It's a hard thing to describe, but it definitely felt so different on the paper doing wet and wet versus watercolor ground. The colors I used for the background, by the way, were my 3 different greens. I used Cascade Green, Green Apatite Genuine, Undersea Green, and I also used some Mayan Blue. All of these colors are absolutely gorgeous. I also introduced a little of the Imperial Purple to make some of the areas darker in the background. Now to finish up these 2 paintings, I thought I would glaze one more layer of Cascade Green, wet and dry, all over the background. I thought that helped soften out sort of the splotchy look of the background, and it did improve with my paper as well. Overall, I was so happy with the result. There are the 2 finished paintings side by side. I think you can definitely see a difference in the granulation, especially on these 2 paintings. Here's the painting done on paper. I think the paper tends to show off the granulation quite a bit more. You can see the shimmery Mayan Blue, the Cascade Green, and the Opera Rose. Those are all very much highlighted by the surface of the cold pressed paper, which is so beautiful. With the canvas prepared with watercolor ground, unfortunately some of the granulation gets a little bit lost. You can definitely see a little of it, but it's certainly not as emphasized as when you paint on paper. The colors are just as vibrant with both paintings. I tried to use exactly the same techniques with each painting and the same amount of paint, the same values and brush strokes. So I think they ended up looking really close. And the very cool thing about painting on a canvas is that you can actually varnish it and frame it without glass. So if you wanted to take your tiny little canvas and varnish it, you can just put a frame on it and hang it up and it's ready to go. So the varnish I like to use is Krylon. It's this UV archival varnish. It's a gloss finish and you can apply 2 or 3 coats to protect your watercolor painting. It'll help it look a little bit more glossy too, which looks really nice on a finished painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this canvas versus watercolor paper experiment. I had a lot of fun painting this rose. If you want to know more about watercolor, be sure to download my free guide. I'll leave a link for that in the description below. Thanks for watching and I'll see you again in the next video.